Namaskar. We at the Adhivakta Parishad Himachal Pradesh start by wishing you and your families our personal best for your health and safety in these difficult times when the humanity is facing one of its hardest, darkest period in the living memory. A virus not visible by the naked eyes put the whole world on a pause. The pandemic forced us into a world only made possible through technology, especially the justice delivery system. But as someone has said, that the show must go on. So the first virtual lecture series was started by the Adhivakta Parishad Himachal Pradesh last year after the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, throwing all of us into the uncharted waters in search of a new normal. And today, we are here with the concluding lecture of the Dr. B.R. Ambedkar lecture series. We are very pleased to able to welcome those of you that have been with us for a long time now during the entire lecture series, and also those who are new today. I'm Advocate Ajay Sipaiya and joined today by Learned Deputy Advocate General, Honorable High Court of Himachal Pradesh, Shri Yadvi Singh Thakurji. And to enlighten us on today's topic, we have with us our guest speaker, Additional Solicitor General of India, Senior Advocate Shri Vikramjit Banerjee ji. The recorded versions of all the lectures by the distinguished speakers in our lecture series is already available on the YouTube channel. So kindly subscribe us on the YouTube and follow us on Facebook. If you have any questions during the lectures, kindly type them in the comment section of the YouTube or the live stream of the Facebook. I will bring them up after the lecture as we will be having a specific time slot for the Q&A round. So now without further ado, we will start the concluding lecture of our lecture series with a welcome address by Learned Deputy Advocate General, Honorable High Court of Himachal Pradesh, Shri Yudhvir Singh Thakurji. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sipaiya. Good evening to all. Before I take the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker for today's lecture, please allow me to express my gratitude to Mr. R.P. Verma, State President, Mr. Avinash Sharma, Working President, Mr. Amit Singh Chandel, General Secretary of Adhivakta Parishad Himachal Pradesh, and his entire team for their work of successfully organizing this erudite lecture series. Today is the 12th lecture of this series, 12th and concluding lecture. I would also thank them for bringing together such fine speakers to address on various issues of legal and national concern. So in this chain, today we have with us Mr. Vikramjit Banerjee, Additional Solicitor General of India. Mr. Banerjee is a graduate of National Law School of India, University from Bangalore. He completed his LLM in 2000, following which he started practicing in Calcutta High Court. 8 years later, he moved to the Supreme Court, where he has been practicing ever since. Mr. Banerjee has served as Advocate General of Nagaland. Since 2018, Mr. Banerjee is serving as Additional Solicitor General of India in Supreme Court of India. It's indeed a special privilege and pleasure to welcome Mr. Banerjee on behalf of Adhivakta Parishad to this lecture, who is going to talk to us about the social equity and constitution, the topic of today's lecture. I also welcome and thank all of you for joining us. So now, without taking any further time, I would request Mr. Vikramjit Banerjee to please speak on the topic. Thank you.
Namaskar. Thank you, Yudhvirji and Ajayji, and thank you, Vivulji, for this wonderful, wonderful, and very kind introduction. Uh, and you know, when the topic was put to me, as to, you have to speak on a topic of your choosing. According to me, what could be a better topic? What could be a better topic when speaking on a lecture series named after Baba Sahib Ambedkar, but to speak on social equity and the Constitution. Because social equity is extremely important. And as I would come to the end of my sort of small talk, which I'm going to present to you, I would say why it has become even more important today, especially in India. But without much ado, without much delay, let us jump into the main question. What is social equity? That's the first part of the question. Social equity, as we were just discussing before, we launched into this sort of talk, is in Hindi translates to something like Samajik Swamitra, so that friendship, social friendship, approximately. And it basically indicates an attempt to create a state which treats all its citizens in a fair manner. It does not necessarily mean that it wants to create a state which treats everybody completely equally, because as we know that complete equality may not be possible in the world, may not be possible in nature, and in every instance in which it has been tried, it has not succeeded. But it attempts to create, what social equity does is it attempts to create a society which is in very many ways fairly treats everybody in society, so that everybody can be taken along when the society develops, when the society progresses, and when the society achieves the ultimate objective of a developed, progressed society. Now, in Indian terms, the question comes in, if you discuss in terms of social equity, there are lots of Western ways to describe it. There are, I can discuss, there are a lot of discussions in Western societies as to how to describe social equity, what are the ways and means to achieve this social equity, how societies can work towards achieving a system of governance which ensures justice to everybody and social equity to all. But we have to realize this, and I am completely of the view that if we are going to discuss the Indian Constitution, if we are going to discuss India, then it is extremely important that we discuss it in the context of India. So what is social equity in terms of things of what we know? What is Indian social equity? There are two broad things, and I'll start off before I go on to in greater detail. There are two major ways which social equity has been described. What is social equity has been described? One is Sarvodaya. Sarvodaya has been articulated and on very many occasions by Mahatma Gandhi. It has also been touched upon, was part of Loknayak Jayaprakash Narayan's Total Revolution. Sarvodaya was a concept which says you have kindness to everyone. That is one way to ensure social equity. The other is something which we are all used to listening, we are all used to hearing, which we refer to quite often in our discussions, is the concept of Antodaya. Antodaya is by Deen Dayal Upadhyay. Now, Deen Dayal Upadhyay's Antodaya there is a slight difference. Deen Dayal Upadhyay's Antodaya says that you have to have kindness for the last person in the line. So till you have kindness for the last person in the line, that is only when your entire ideology of kindness gets fulfilled. So it is not for all, it is for the weakest. And I think that our conceptions of social equity should be greatly inspired by Deen Dayalji, because in today's world, it is easy to say that you have kindness, you want to create a society which is kind to all, but it's very difficult to have a society or work towards creating a society where the last person, the most disenfranchised person, is uplifted. The state is kind to them. Because from as experience as we all know as lawyers, we know how the people who are not empowered, people who don't exercise power, are treated by uh, by the organs of the government. We face it every day. We appear on their behalf. We see it as part of our profession. Um, that being said, I'll come back to that later. Uh, taking inspiration from that, it is very important to uh, discuss again. I'll go back to my entire concept of what were the four methods. There are broadly, I would say, four methods of creating the social equity. If we leave aside Deen Dayal Upadhyayji's reference, which we'll come to towards the later part of our speech, but leaving that aside, there are four broad methods. One is Mahatma Gandhiji's, uh, Sarvodaya, and Mahatma Gandhiji's concept of trusteeship, where he believed that the rich should be and the powerful should be a trustee to power or wealth on behalf of the poor or the unempowered, and they should exercise their power in a way which they would act as a trustee. That is, I am acting on your behalf. A trustee is someone who's acting on their behalf. So I don't act as the owner of power. I act as if I'm acting on somebody else's behalf. So, uh, Loknayak Jayaprakash Narayan, in his Total Revolution, his concept of Total Revolution, incorporated that. Vinoba Bhaveji, Acharya Devanath Bhaveji also incorporated that in his the way he viewed the world. The second, is again it's a controversial interpretation, but it's an interpretation which is with us every day, and some interpretation which we cannot disregard, but we have to take into account. The other is the interpretation of Ram Manohar Lohia. Now, Ram Manohar Lohia's interpretation, and this is the controversial which we hear today, but it's an interpretation of how you achieve social equity. Ram Manohar Lohia's vision was that in India today, you see that there are three kinds of people who basically rule India. He spoke about the people who speak English, so people who are good at English, people like us. People who are wealthy, who may not be like us, and people who are, for the want of a better word, which he used, is upper caste. So he said sometimes it overlaps in all three, sometimes it is one of all three, but eventually if you see the formulation as to who rules India, you will see it comes from one of these three categories. And he wanted to have a state which would reduce the dominance of these three and want to have a largely egalitarian state and create more equitable society. Not an egalitarian society, not an equal society, but a society which is egalitarian, equitable, so that he wanted the people who are not empowered, who fell outside the category, to be empowered. And one of the ways he saw that happening was, as he said, that you have to ensure the representation in government happens. And he also said, very controversially, he encouraged great amount of intermarriage. So he said this was some of his prescriptions, but he wanted a more egalitarian society. The third is what Baba Sahib Ambedkar said. And again, Baba Sahib Ambedkar, to analyze Baba Sahib Ambedkar, you have to look at where Baba Sahib Ambedkar's background is from. Baba Sahib Ambedkar, obviously, I'm not talking about the social background. We know that he comes from a very dispossessed background. He's from a Dalit background. Even though at that point of time that was not the word which was used, it was depressed classes which was used approximately at that point of time. But he had the benefit of fantastic education. He had the benefit of great education, and he had two PhDs. I don't know whether people know of it. One was a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics, and which he wrote on India's economic structure. And very, very interesting. And I always say that he is the greatest finance minister that India never had. And two is he had a PhD in law from Columbia. Now, while he was in Columbia University in the United States of America, he he was part of the discussion which was going on in America at that point of time as to how to create a socially equitable America, which still goes on today. The greatest issue is America still faces those issues. And I was discussing with someone that we solved a part of those issues in at the time of our constitution. And Baba Sahib Ambedkar, who was part of those debates at that instant, on those occasions, came back and incorporated the discussions which he was having and incorporated them into the constitution. And America still has not been able to resolve those issues. If anybody, if we couldn't have watched or missed television, so we would have seen the Black Lives Matter debate. The entire question when Baba Sahib was in America, that question was there. How do you create a socially equitable America, whereby the blacks have adequate representation in American mainstream life? And the Americans have not been able to solve it. They've tried lots of things, but they have not been able to, in many ways, address it front and proper. But the ironical thing is, we were able to address it front and proper. We were able to address it because Baba Sahib, who did a PhD, and any one of you read Baba Sahib's books, including, very many, including the one on partition of India, Pakistan, you would know that Baba Sahib would do incredible amount of research, and he was some of the most perceptive observers of how to analyze society. So Baba Sahib's vision, which he wanted to incorporate, was this entire concept of reservation, and I'll address to that. And I think, to a great extent, the reason why we don't see, and I'm sure there are still discrimination which exists in our society. Let's not say that they do not exist. Of course they exist. But the reason why we have not faced a situation on the lines of Black Lives Matter and on the violence which is engendered by Black Lives Matter is because of Baba Sahib's ability to address and the solutions which he came inspired for Columbia. Now, who inspired Baba Sahib in Columbia? Baba Sahib always used to say that he was deeply inspired by his professor called John Dewey. John Dewey was one of those educationalists, greatly involved in education, and a humanist, and he was a member of the practicalist movement, and he spoke about all these issues which were at the forefront as to that you needed the blacks in America to be educated, and you have to lift them up, and you have to provide them reservations in education, which is now part of affirmative action in some of the best colleges in America. But it's still controversial. It is still challenged in Supreme Court while we have had it in our Constitution. So in many ways, that is one way to look at it, that to have a socially equitable system of governance, it is important to provide reservations or affirmative action, or action which will help the disempowered, the unempowered in your society to be better placed. The fourth, according to me, and this is, with the exception of Deen Dayalji, whom I'll address right at the end of my talk, is Swami Vivekananda. Now, Swami Vivekananda had a very interesting analysis of society. Swami Vivekananda believed that you divide the world in different ages. And, he believed that, he used the very word, again, and I'm not using it controversially because it has controversial connotations today, but he used this word as he used it very regularly. He used the word called Shudra Jagaran. And he did not use the word in a casteist term. He used the word, and he explicitly writes that he said that you have to awaken the poor, the disempowered, the unempowered. In his very famous speech, which is so oft quoted on New India, he says the New India will arise from the poor, from the huts of the impoverished, from the fritter seller, from the fritter seller's cart. Almost like, as you would say, as our Prime Minister speaks about of being a chaiwala on the platform, and he said that is where your new India is going to rise from. And he says, you of the old world, your world is perishing, your world will be gone. So he basically spoke that it is the duty of the empowered, people who are empowered, to raise the unempowered. He says it is incumbent upon them to raise the unempowered to their level. And he says, don't push them down, because don't push those who are forward backward. Don't pull them down. Bring everybody forward. So that is one way to address. That's what Swami Vivekananda addressed it. And of course, the fifth one is what I said, is Deen Dayal Upadhyayji's very, very interesting conception of Antodaya, having kindness to the last person in time, which I think is very, very difficult to do. That being said, what does the Constitution say? The Constitution, now I'll slowly take you through the preamble. I'll address it: preamble, fundamental rights, directive principle, state policy. The preamble says, the state will promote justice, social, economic, and political. And it's very important to note, and I always say this, that if every constitution has a value, if every constitution has a dominating value, if the Americans' constitutional value is liberty, freedom to do whatever you want to. If the French constitution talks about equality being its dominating principle, if the British constitutional law speaks about, of the clash between king and parliament, which is its historical struggle, the main value of the Indian constitution has always been justice. And if you look at the constitution, it says that the objective of the state is to provide social, economic, political justice. And interestingly, even in Article 32, it encapsulates unusually the right to approach the Supreme Court as a fundamental right. On so many occasions, it's this concept of justice which is at the core of Indian Constitution. And I would say there is a historical precedent. This is my interpretation of it. And I would say the reason why it says is because justice goes back to a very old Indian principle which we are all used to, which we don't want to articulate it because it doesn't sound modern enough, but it is the concept of dharma. Now, if you translate the word dharma into constitutional law, the only approximate word which you can have is justice. So it says very clearly that the object of the state is to provide justice, social, economic, and political. To create social equity, you have to have justice, social, political, and economical. Then it says that the state has to promote equality of status and opportunity. That's encapsulated in your preamble. That you have to promote equality of status, that is, everybody should be equal, and opportunity, everybody should be able to succeed, and fraternity, ensuring the dignity of every individual and the integrity of the nation. But whenever people quote preamble to you, please also ensure that you quote the preamble in detail what it says. That it says, not for promoting fraternity, not only is it about the dignity of the individual, but it should be balanced by the integrity of the nation. And the word nation is used. So if you talk about what does the Constitution envisage, you have to sort of basically talk about, 3 or 4 values. One is justice, equality, freedom. That is also one value. And fraternity. And they talk about you have to balance all these interests. And according to me, what comes out of this is the attempt of the constitutional framers to have a society which is socially equitable, which carries everybody equally along with it. So progress not of the few, but progress of the very many. Now again, I'll address the controversial questions, controversial issues. Fundamental Rights chapter. Fundamental Rights chapter 14, Article 14, we all know is the right to equality principle, but then the Supreme Court has said right to equality means treating equally, unequal unequally, so that, don't treat unequal people equally. Second, in Article 15, they said that you can make special provisions for, people who are, for women, children, and socially and educationally backward people, including scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. You can make provisions for them in employment. In 16, you can provide reservations to affirmative action as well. In 17, the Constitution abolishes untouchability. In Article 18, it abolishes titles. Now, all of us today sometimes when I read the constitutional law when I was in national law school, I would think, what about titles? Why is it so controversial? But anyone of our grandfather generation or our great-grandfather generation would know how controversial the giving of Indian titles of Rai Bahadur, Rai Saab was, and how much of resentment it created in society. So the Constitution says abolish titles. The Constitution then goes on to prohibit forced labor. Now, this is extremely unusual for a Constitution to address this in great detail. So not only does it allow for provisions of reservations for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, which we talk about as one of the ways of achieving social equity, and I discussed this, that America still has not been able to address this, even though Baba Sahib sort of got this idea from America and incorporated that in our Constitution. But it does prohibit forced labor. It does prohibit employment of children in dangerous jobs. So, you have to realize that the Constitution, these are fundamental rights. When you talk about American fundamental rights, you have fundamental rights written in the American Constitution. You have, freedom to do this, freedom to do that. Of course, we have all that, but subject to reasonable restrictions. We don't have unlimited freedom. But on the other hand, we have always worked towards ensuring our right to equality is not a blanket right, just an Article 14 right, which is there in most constitutions in the world, Article 14. But it's a much more nuanced right, suited for Indian constitutions, tailored for Indian needs, and created to create a society which is definitely more equitable. Now, coming to directive principles of state policy. Now, all of us know, whoever's read directive principles of state policy, the first, Article 38, which again gets back to the entire concept of justice, says, you have to promote a social order for social, economic, and political justice. Which again reiterates the entire concept of how important we hold social, economic, and political justice. You incorporate that in the preamble. It is like Article 38 of this, like the first provision of your directive principles of state policy. And though directive principles of state policy was not made implementable, but the Supreme Court, a number of judgments said that you can sort of use directive principles of state policy to interpret the law and to strengthen fundamental rights. So I think it's in many ways it has become legally, may not be implementable, may not be enforceable per se, but it does have huge legal weight today interpreting the Constitution. Article 39 speaks about, the state shall provide adequate means of livelihood, and it says very interestingly, and this is something that all natural resource, material resources was to be used for common good. So you can't have a system which is not used for common good. So all the material resources of the country will be for common good. It speaks about there should not be any concentration of wealth. Now this is extremely controversial, but it does exist in the difference of state policy. It talks about equal pay for equal work. It talks about that you have to promote health of workers, and it talks about that children and youth should not be exploited. And then, of course, there are the principles of Article 44, and which talks about uniform civil code. which says that rights of women are to be protected, and ensuring that everybody is subject to the same law in this country, so that the weak, the unempowered, the disempowered of this country, and the worst treated in the entire scheme of things have been historically. And I'm not saying, I'm not a person. I'm in many ways like Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda used to say, don't think that everything in the past is glorious. There were mistakes made in the past, and I think one of the mistakes which we made in the past is our treatment of women. And I think Uniform Civil Code puts out a pathway as to how this issue could be addressed, that all women should, everybody should have equal rights. There should be a Uniform Civil Code cutting across all communities. And then, of course, the famous Gandhian principles of directive principle state policy, which talks about ensuring protection of cows, and promoting Gram Swaraj, and so many other things, ensuring handicrafts. So in many ways, talking about systems will take care of a large part of India which exists in the villages, and which is also a large part of India a majority of India which exists in the villages, as well as a large part of the poor which exist in India. I think the most striking amounts of poverty which still exist in India is still in the villages. And it talks about that, the Constitution talks about, and very unusually, I think this is unique in the history of the world, that it talks about a system whereby you can take care of the poor villager, of the poor unempowered person living in the remotest corner of India. And it wants to therefore promote that equality. Supreme Court in a large number of judgments have discussed and talked about that, what sort of governance, what sort of government should India look forward to. It is used, controversially in our constitution, I'll address this later, is there are two words which have been added retrospectively by amending the constitution in the preamble. One is secularism, one is socialism. Extremely controversial. But I think adequate work on socialism has not been done. The Supreme Court has tried to interpret socialism, as I'll say, as a mixture of Gandhian thought and Marxian values. Now, what is Gandhian thought and Marxian values? I would like to suggest that if, and I'll come to that later, what my suggestions on that are. But I think the fact is, in many ways, socialism may not be an integral part of our constitution, but definitely social justice is. And why is it important? Why is it important that we discuss this now? Why did I choose the topic now? Because I have not so far spoken on social equity, I think, in so many places that you've asked me. Because according to me, the biggest thing which moved me to talk about social equity is, number one, because it was Baba Saheb's lecture series, and two, because of the pandemic. All of us know that the people who have been affected the most are the very poor. The people who have been relatively well off have been able to not go out for work, not indulge in economic activity, and therefore they have been protected from the worst effects. They have been I think we've all been affected. It's been horrible for us. We all near and dear ones have been affected. But nonetheless, the poor were in a situation where they were starving at home, and when they were being forced out to go, they were being exposed to the pandemic. And I think after the pandemic ends, I think it would have affected a lot of people. People who were living day to day would have been affected greatly. So I think it's very important now to again start thinking about the concept of social equity once more. It used to be part of the Indian debate. It used to be part of Indian constitutional law debate, maybe 30 years before liberalization, before globalization actually took over in the 1990s. We saw that, for those of us of our age, we saw that happening right in front of our eyes. We saw India opening up. We saw the usual discussion of socialism die out. But my intention is not to discuss socialism. I have no love lost for socialism. But I do therefore I'm talking about social equity. A social equity means a heart, like Deen Dayal Upadhyay ji, like Swami Vivekananda, which beats for the poor, which beats for the unempowered, which beats for the uh, disempowered. And we need to take it seriously. And we need to take, um, the entire concept of what Deen Dayal Upadhyay ji said is having antodaya, for having kindness to the last person on the line, extremely seriously. If we are not going to face a situation which is going to breed intense amounts of resentment of the unempowered towards the empowered, we are seeing that happening across globally now, post the pandemic. I think it's time that we need to address this. My last suggestion, and I say this, um, after speaking so much, is coming back to the entire thing, is that we need to interpret the word socialism just like the Supreme Court has, when it interprets secularism, we know it's talked about sarvadharma samabhav, ekam sat vipra bahuda vadanti, saying that, equidistant from all religions. That is how the Supreme Court has interpreted secularism. But for socialism, it has come by a strange mix on Marx and Gandhi, which I think is, in many ways, while it has relied on Indian conceptions of governance to interpret secularism, it has not relied on Indian conceptions of social equity when interpreting socialism. I think we need to have something. We need to have a government whose heart, or social structure, a constitutional interpretation whose heart beats for the unempowered, for the poor. I would want it if somebody asked me how I would want an interpretation of the Constitution, how I would want to interpret the word socialism which exists in the preamble of the Constitution today, in context of the developments, in context of the world which we are going to enter after we are going to finish the pandemic. I would say it should mix the two conceptions of Antodaya, of Deen Dayal Upadhyay ji's conception of having, feeling for the the weakest link in the chain, and also an active participation of Shudra Jagaran in the way which Swami Vivekananda meant it. That you actively have to ensure education and ensure the benefits of civilization, benefits of education, benefits of the wealth which exists in society, which should reach the poorest bracket. One of them is education. But I think it is most important, in conclusion, to realize that if we are talking about a new India, if we are talking about a constitution for a new India, the only way to go about doing it is to have an interpretation which works for the majority of its people. And to that, we have to have a constitution which is interpreted through the lens of social equity. Of course, social equity, which is based on Indian conceptions of what an equal society is, and Indian conceptions of the world which it wants to achieve. Now, quoting from Swami Vivekananda's New India, which the famous speech which he spoke about New India is, it is important for us to realize that not everything in our past was good, and not everything of the West is good. We have to use the tools and bits of material civilization which will help the poor. So whatever, as Swami Vivekananda numerous times said, whatever uplifts the state of the poor, I am with it. So I would only say that going forward, I would like to have a constitutional interpretation, and I think we should all look forward to a constitutional interpretation whose hearts beat for the poor in India, for the most underdeveloped in India, and people who are most disenfranchised in this country. Jai Hind, Bharat Mata ki Jai.
Thank you very much, sir, for enlightening us. So that now we will take certain questions which have been posted by the viewers. Now the first question is from Shweta Mohit Sharma. So, in our opinion, how far you think the Constitution fulfilled the test of social justice and equity?
Um, the Constitution is framed for social justice and equity, but how much of it has, if you ask me personally, I would say it has gone in waves. Like the Constitution in the first 20 years was not interpreted in a way which promoted social justice and equity. In the next 20 years, it was. In the 70s, it was. Um, it created in the garb of socialism, and it had because it was. I would put it this way: because it was interpreted in the garb of westernized socialism, so therefore it has its ill consequences. We know one of them was, of course, which resulted in was emergency, which because socialism which did not come from the people, a socialism which came from being imposed, which is Western style socialism. So therefore it had a lot of unforeseen consequences and I would say downsides. Then we had liberalization, whereby a lot of these sort of pro-poor measures were overtaken by liberalization and and forces of that sort. Um, but I think maybe the cycle has come to an end, and after pandemic we may have to look at it afresh. So the interpretation of the constitution has been interpreted in different phases. But have we been able to realize the goals of our constitution? No, not at all. We should aspire to reach that.
So, the follow up question by Shweta Mohit Sharma is: there was a statement by Justice Katchu that our Constitution has outlived its utility. What is your take on this opinion? Does our Constitution need a social upheaval or renovation?
Um, uh, you know, we all know what we think of Justice Kanju, but I'll take the question in the spirit of it without going into the details. I don't think the Constitution has outlived its utility. I think it's a great Constitution. I think it's a Constitution, and I always tell people this. There are a lot of people who feel that the Constitution was imposed upon us. There are a lot of people who think that this constitution did not consult majority of its people, so it's not in akin to Indian culture, opposed to Indian culture. But I have one sort of answer to that. My answer is this: that we disregard that when we wanted to form a constitution, uh, there was consensus across the board that we wanted to create a modern state inspired by our ancient civilizational values. We did not want to go back 200 years. And I'll give you an example why. Mahatma Gandhi ji framed the constitution and worked it in the state of Aun based on his Chayati Raj. And it worked for 3 years. It was made in the state of Aun. It was ratified by Congress. Drafts were circulated to the Constituent Assembly. Constituent Assembly clearly decided that we wanted a modern constitution. And the reason I like to think of it, and the way I interpret it, is what Swami Vivekananda said. That everything, for you to live in this new age, you have to take inspiration from your past. You cannot be Western, but you can't go back home. You have to discard things which were not good. And for the modern age, the consensus across the board was we needed a modern constitution. And I think we've worked the modern constitution very well for nearly 70 years. So we put in lots of parts which were not, we've nuanced the concept of equality, we have nuanced the concept of so many other things, of federalism. We brought in nuances which were not conceived at the time of the constitution was framed. We brought them into, so we worked out the constitution for 70 years. So I think the constitution has space to be worked out and to be interpreted creatively for a new India, which Swami Vivekananda actually envisioned. He always spoke about a new India.
So I want to ask you one question. That as you said that you were inspired today's topic, you was basically the reason was the ongoing pandemic. So I want to ask you, as this COVID-19 virus does not know any discrimination. So what is your take with regard to the ongoing pandemic and the social equity in relation to the access of the poor people to the virtual world? Because everything is basically confined to this virtual world,
I agree.
practically
I agree.
all the fields.
I agree. I agree.
So,
I
so
agree
what's your
completely
take?
with you. I think my take is it's been horrible on the poor. We as lawyers know it. In our hearts we know what has happened. It's been okay. I'm not saying it's been okay for us. I think the worst hit were people in trial courts. I think so. And I think, but we know what has happened. We know what has happened to people who were economically not strong, even from within our community. Let alone the our clerks or our whoever we've managed to protect, we have protected. But we have seen what has happened around, and we know the transition to the virtual world, which may stay post pandemic. How discriminatory it can be in certain ways. How do we solve that? How do we do that? That is something which we have to see. I don't have answers for that because the pandemic has happened in 1.5 years. Our world has been turned upside down, and I think a lot of the changes which are going to be made, which have been made by the pandemic, is here to stay. I think that could, and the only people, and we have the most amount of poor people in, for the want of a better word, quantitatively. We have a lot of poor people in the world. We may not have the most, but we have a lot of poor people in the world. And we have to ensure that, and the disproportionate impact has been on them post-pandemic. Virtual realities, of course, I agree with you. I agree with you completely.
So now, anything else you want to cover up before the wrap up of the
No,
session?
I'm fine. If there's anything you want me to wrap up, I can address.
Because basically everything, as you have illustrated, you have given a lecture so vividly that everything is clear to all the viewers, I guess.
I
So
don't know, but
no, certainly. So, sir, thank you very much for such an enlightening lecture and for answering the queries. And we are grateful to you that despite your busy schedule, you agreed to deliver the concluding lecture of our this Dr. B.R. Ambedkar lecture series, sir. And in the end, I would like to say that we at the Adhivakta Parishad Himachal Pradesh will be feeling in our duty to show our gratitude to all the distinguished and eminent speakers which have been the part of our lecture series. And I'm sure that all the viewers have been benefited by all the meaningful and the enlightening lectures. We thank you all for being with us. It has been a great pleasure. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.